Hey there, this is going to be a laid back draw with me session, although in this case I think we're going to do some coloring digitally. We'll color this image that I did in a previous video, and before we do that we'll check out some cool art that I saw hang around the internet. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name's Tim Mcburnie. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. This session is for the 1st of October 2022, although I'm in Australia, you might be ahead or behind depending on your location on this planet. I'm going to check out ArtStation, and this is what the front page looks like today. I chose a few things from, sort of other days earlier in the week though, because again, I just sort of found that there was some cool stuff that was posted a little bit earlier. The first thing I saw was actually one of these Dragon's Rise challenges from ArtStation that I think was just sort of posted a little bit later. And again, I just thought so many of these were cool. I've showed a few of them on previous sessions. This one is by Gian Ploneves, and yeah, I just thought this was cool. Again, I keep kind of saying, like, often I feel like the ideas that people sort of come up with, especially concept artists and people who really sort of deal in ideas. Often, yeah, the raw ideas that people have are often sort of so cool, a lot more interesting to me anyway than the stuff that we sort of end up with in games. Yeah, I just feel like this is such a cool bunch of designs, and I'm just like, I just want to figure out, hear more about what's going on here. But yeah, I thought this one was super cool. Again, some like weird dragon ideas that I always sort of appreciate. And yeah, cool elf girls and weird sort of fish guy. Super fun. The second thing that I saw was, again, this sort of ship design by Ivan Rastkin. And yeah, this is again really cool. This is actually for a project that I've been working on as well, although again I don't do many of these kind of like ships at the moment. But yeah, I think that, again, just a really good example of how the 3D workflow has kind of taken over concept design for sort of spaceships and stuff like that. But yeah, I thought these were just really cool because, again, it's such like an interesting, weird sort of design, like a retrofitted sort of oil tanker kind of thing. But yeah, just like a really fun design. And I thought, again, like the sort of final images that sort of really showed everything off were really cool as well. But yeah, again, a great example of how much sort of detail you can get with that 3D production pipeline. And not just that, but again, when you sort of combine those concept design skills with some sort of illustration, you can get some really cool results. And I think that's what we're sort of seeing now with this kind of process is, the 3D side of it has gotten a lot more approachable for artists. And yeah, although certainly, sort of doing this level of stuff is probably still, above my pay grade in terms of just the complexity of it. But yeah, when you sort of go and look at the finished result that you sort of get, once you kind of put all those things together. And again, remember that, like, this is concept art. This is not. I mean, these are keyframe illustrations of a ship, but yeah, this is not sort of final models or anything like that. It's still just kind of yeah, for just for ideation purposes. But yeah, super cool to see this. I just thought I saw these ages ago. It's cool to see that they posted them. And yeah, just a really nice sort of mix of 3D design and sort of illustration and presentation. The next thing I saw that I thought was sort of fun was some Pinocchio film concept art by Roberto F. Castro. And yeah, again, this is interesting to me because I sort of did a graphic novel adaptation for the French market of Pinocchio. And so I'm always interested in the different takes that people have on this. But I thought this was like a really good Again, just sort of iconic design of what I'm sort of assuming is the sort of Geppetto sort of shop. Yeah, really, really cool. And again, it's sort of it's always interesting to see how those things kind of play out, right? I remember that when I was, sort of probably this would have been like in 2012 or 2011, I think, when we were trying to pitch the Pinocchio book. At that time, there was 3 Pinocchio movies that was sort of in production, and we thought that would sort of help the book get sort of published as well. They all sort of fell through, but now they've all sort of come back to life, and I think now we've sort of got the Disney version, which looks like it's just like, again, one of these sort of just remake, like full on remake. So not doing a redesign on Pinocchio, using the old design. And I think there's also the Del Toro one, which looks really, really interesting. So yeah, I think both of those were maybe in production when I was sort of thinking about the graphic novel, and there was also like an Adventures of Geppetto sort of movie that was going around as well. There's like so much Pinocchio stuff that was gonna maybe be made. But yeah, I'm actually interested to check these out and see what they did. Next thing I saw was just some really, really cool splash screen style pinup art by Alex Flores. Again, someone at sort of Riot Games who's really into that kind of, super impactful, shiny style of sort of making art. And this is just a really, really, really great example of that. So yeah, it was just sort of, again, made me realize, sort of how much I have to sort of work on that stuff, because I've been doing a lot of sort of cover work and that sort of type of imagery recently. And yeah, whenever I see this really, really great pin-up style splash screen art, just reminds me, again, how much you can get out of just a character and a background, and also just, again, how far you can sort of push the graphic impact of your pieces. Anyway, let's jump over to Photoshop and start doing some coloring. All right, so for this one, I'm just going to go through the process that I would normally go through. I haven't actually done this for a while, and this is a sort of new install of a workstation, so there might be a few hiccups along the way, but I think that will be actually a good way for me to, sort of share some of the slower ways of doing this, right? Because again, I'm not sort of just speeding along. Now, if you'd like to learn more about how I'm doing a lot of these things, really from a technical standpoint, you could also check out my free Quick Start Guide. It's designed to get you up and running quickly, doing this whole process in Photoshop. So the thumbnail, the lines, the color, and it really focuses on how you should build and develop a really simple, reliable process. Some of the things I'm going to talk about in this video are a little bit sort of different to the Quick Start Guide. But if you want the step-by-step, all digital sort of version of that, and also some of the brushes that I'm going to use here, go check out the Quick Start Guide. It's free. The link will be in the description. So the first thing I've got here is just a pretty raw scan. And yeah, I guess we don't necessarily need to crop this straight away, but that is something you could sort of think about. What I probably will do is at least kind of crop it in here, because I think what I'm going to do is, yeah, not sort of have that border on it. I could sort of include that border in the image, but yeah, I think we're going to sort of be better off doing something like that. But I'm going to turn off delete crop pixels, and that means when I sort of hit this, we still kind of have the old one there. I'm going to make a new white layer. So just make new white layer, fill with white. I have that set to a action. So it's a keyboard shortcut in Photoshop. And yeah, it might actually be sort of something where, if we sort of crop in a little bit more, then that might give us a little bit more room to sort of position things. And you can see this is sort of coming out here. What we could do is Control T on this and just Control Alt and sort of drag that out. So this is going to distort the image a little bit, but I don't think it sort of matters that much. It's distorting it a very, very tiny amount. So again, can be useful to, right? Because I kind of want it sort of centered. So let's see if we can sort of pull that out. See whether that affects things too much. I think that's all right. So the next thing I do is I sort of run a set of actions on here that will, and I think if it's this, there we go, this one, oh, we're in grayscale. Okay, yeah. Well, that won't work. So again, get out of grayscale. Let's go to history, window, history. So again, this is all the things that aren't set up on this machine. But again, that's probably good because then we've sort of got a bit more of a default install. So yeah, I'll probably leave it sort of there. All right, so let's go image mode, because normally when we scan, it's, you sort of just do it in grayscale because we don't need that. Now I've got something in color. Now if I hit that set of actions, right, it's going to give me sort of something like this, which all this is and I've got, if you watch some of the other videos that talk about specifically how to color your sort of drawing, I go over a lot of these sort of topics there as well, so better off to check those out if you're kind of after the specifics of it. But I'll just sort of roll over and roll through this and sort of do it how I normally would. But yeah, certainly if you want to get a bit more of that technical information, check out that video, because I basically do the same thing. Boom. So I'm just putting a bit more sort of crunch in those lines. And again, because that's a set of levels, right, we can adjust that at any time. See how we go. And again, for a color scheme, if I'm ever sort of stuck, I think I've sort of said this before, one of the simplest things that I think you can do is just kind of think about what colors need to be there to begin with. So what things need to be there in the start, and how can we kind of use those simple colors that exist to kind of frame our choices. So again, I like the idea that it's kind of again, this is sort of some water magic sort of stuff. So we start with a blue. Now again, I'm probably going to start with a little bit more of a desaturated blue, and we can sort of push those colors later if we need. One rule that I, again, if I'm not really sort of thinking about it too much, is that I like the colors for sort of line work to make it feel like a line and color illustration. I like those to be sort of above the 50% value range, right? If they get too dark, then they start to compete with the lines, where if we keep the colors a little bit brighter and focus on color versus value, then I think you will have a little bit more success. Just sort of allowing the lines to breathe. Again, just one of those little sort of rules. So another thing that we could sort of do there that might sort of be interesting again is to think about again, what is the complement of blue, right? Which again is could sort of be sort of orangey, yellowy, sort of anything there, because again it's not like a pure blue here, but it's something over on this side that is going to sort of help us there. All right, and again we'll sort of keep the values pretty similar. And a good way to do this is just to kind of block it in, right? So again, I'm not sure whether this is exactly the type of color that I want. We'll see. And I am just going to sort of block in all of that skin in that color, and we'll see how that goes. Ooh. Again, might be too much, I don't know. Just turn off that camera so it doesn't get in the way. So just being pretty rough with it. Can always sort of clean this up later. And part of the process is probably that I would, at some point, again, color adjust over this. So a big part of what I sort of, think about doing here is kind of building some color contrast in at the beginning that's quite strong and right, feels like it has a lot of impact. So this is one of those colors that might look a little bit more yellow or orange on some screens versus others, because like a higher gamut screen will tend to show the reds a little bit more. So just thinking about those elements. Now, a good thing actually that I should have done, this is where again I'm out of practice doing this kind of work. Let's turn contiguous on so I can really just kind of grab this. Let's grab all these colors. Boom, boom, boom. Let's separate it out. Oh. There we go. So what that does is now I've got the skin on a separate layer. So it means if I want to then go and add another layer underneath, that is going to sort of have different color for whatever she's sort of wearing. Right, that's going to be a little easier. So you see this gets kind of messy, right? But it doesn't really matter for quite a number of reasons, I think. One is that, again, we have this sort of textural brush. So we've got a pretty good, like, there's some energy to the way that it is sketchy. And also we can always sort of clean it up later. All right. I'm also just gonna think about like what color would the hair be. All right, maybe that hair could be, yeah, kind of blue as well. Again, I'm not quite sure what blue. And this is another one of those things where, like, if we sort of treat, like often with digital, we kind of imagine again that you sort of got to control everything. Whereas when you're doing traditional, I think there's a tacit understanding that the medium kind of controls you a bit. You don't have unlimited choices. You can't sort of do anything. There's limits. Again, I need to keep remembering to put this on a separate layer. Just because it'll be easier. Control Shift J will separate those layers out. But if you just kind of start with a color that you know is going to be there for much of it, right? Again, blue, right? It's water. Now again, it's not to say she is underwater, but maybe she's underwater. I don't know. Then what I tend to find happens is that as I build up the image, I'm going to see things like, well, if I leave her hair blue, it kind of might look interesting. Like, does it logically make sense that her hair is blue? No, it doesn't make sense, right? But it's one of those things where, you sort of are more likely to get happy accidents if you build it up based on sort of one color. And again, I think it's totally fine that, so again, we'll shade over this a little bit later to make that make sense. But yeah, so just blocking it in. I think we had another few things. All right, we had these earrings here that didn't really, no one would know there was meant to sort of be some sort of earring there. It might be cool here to have the collar here of this be a slightly different color. Now again, you can see I'm being super rough here, but again, like it's not really going to matter because it's all sort of just coloring a sketch anyway. So the last thing that I feel like we need to consider from a color standpoint is the water magic, right? Or whatever these things are, this kind of magical stuff. Boom, boom. Now, again, I'm starting with a purple that I've derived by just selecting the blue of the hair and just kind of modifying a little bit. Now, why purple? I don't know. Right? It's going to sort of match the color scheme because it's sort of next to the sort of blue on the color wheel, so it's going to feel fairly harmonious. And again, we'll see how much of this needs modifying or sort of blending. Let's cut a bit of this out. Yeah. So again, this is probably, that's probably what I'd sort of consider to be like the initial block in, right? Like does that make sense, right? Does this kind of work? And then we probably set the brush to 50% and we'll put put a little bit of a blue haze over those eyes. Yeah, so again, it's pretty rough, but even at this stage, again, if you're just dealing with line and color, that can be fine, right? We kind of at a good place. And again, I don't know exactly how long we've sort of been in here, but I don't think it's that long. Now, the trick here is I've got all these things on separate layers, right? So it's pretty easy to control U, bring up the hue saturation, right? And change these, right? Make them sort of slightly different colors. I think that is something that's sort of pretty important. We can also, set that to 1. We can also go in and, sort of put some of that color there, right? You could play around with the nuance there, right? Maybe again, depending on how much you wanted that to show. I don't really need that much of it to show. Like, I actually think it might be sort of better without that, but we'll see. Yeah, so again, you can see that it's quite easy to, sort of adjust your color, right? So if we wanted it to be, maybe it's not, maybe it's not water magic, right? Maybe it's some other kind of magic like that. That might be sort of cool. Again, just from a color standpoint, right? Because I don't really care whether it's water magic or sort of something else, right? I'm just sort of really interested in the general sort of graphic flow of it. And this is where, as I said, just doing some sort of simple layer tricks, right, can really help. Can maybe just sort of push. All right, maybe if I push that to the green, that's a little bit more interesting. And yeah, there's plenty of stuff you can kind of play around with like this. Might be good to, right, what color are those eyes? So here I can do a Control U as well. We could sort of play around with, let's go Control H to hide that. Right, and see, like, like what? Should they be blue? Should they be sort of green, blue, orange? What here? I feel like what they were was kind of fine. So again, I'm probably not going to work the eyes or, you know, sort of make that stuff really sort of manga-esque. But yeah, again, I feel like, you know, that for just from a visual interest standpoint, that's kind of working. That's a really good base. So the next thing that I would probably do is, again, I've sort of used this as a really rough way to block in these different elements. And I need to that's right, deselect. So what I can do now is just sort of work on the top and clean it up to a point where I would probably either run out of time or I sort of get sick of it. And that the reason for that is that, you know, some of these areas and little, you know, things aren't going to matter. In some cases, if there's a little bit of brushiness, right, it's gonna help. You know, it's going to help us, going to make it look cooler. And in other cases, yeah, just clean it up, you know, sort that out. But yeah, the thing I like about, you know, working this way is that, yeah, you know, we often get some sort of more abstract colors that work a little bit better. And this works especially well from a process standpoint if we're, you know, not too worried about, you know, any sort of color needing to be a particular way, right? It's not like the hair had to be a particular color or this magic had to be a particular color. And, you know, I think that's often one of the most, it's one of the biggest advantages of just sort of, it's not looking that interesting. Yeah, a good advantage of just being able to sort of do your own personal work, right, is focus on what's visually interesting. I think where you really need to know color theory a little bit more is when, like the brief is given to you, and you know what the color of this magic is, and what the color of the hair is, and the skin is. It's kind of predefined, right? And that's been predefined by someone who is not a great visual designer. Which is very frequent, and in that case you have to do more gymnastics to find some, right? You can't just kind of be fiddling around and be like, oh, that looks cool, let's do it, sand it, good. Yeah, you got to think about it a little bit more. So yeah, just doing a little bit of cleanup. I'm just kind of looking at areas that are, you know, sort of close to that sort of focal area, and yeah, just sort of going through, am I missing anything? So focal area would just be sort of around the face. Now, again, there's many different options for how you could kind of push this forward, right? And you know, some of the ways that I've kind of shown in, you know, previous videos are really about, you know, adding a shading layer to this. And another thing that I find can work is to kind of treat it a little bit more like a painting. And by that, I just mean we're sort of just going to select the colors here. I'm going to make a new layer. And what I can do is I sort of do have, right? I do have this stuff selected, right? So I can kind of go here and select like all the skin, right? And that means, again, if I sort of want to paint on something, right, I've got that selection for the skin. So because I've just been painting with the pencil tool, again, it allows me to do that. But yeah, here I could try and sort of say, well, what is a good shadow color here, right? How can I maybe, you know, sort of create some shadow? Now, it doesn't have to be a situation where we're thinking about lighting, which again, I don't think we sort of want to do for this. But actually don't want that to be that strong. But what I do want to do is just kind of push some of these shadows around the place. Right, and kind of maybe think about, again, something we could do is sort of have all of this neck in shadow. Oh. And that might bring those hands forward a little bit. Again, not 100% sure if that's a good idea. We could also sort of do something right to kind of play around with that. So again, you can totally explore the degree to which we want to, if you're sort of experimenting with different sort of things. Again, there's not always a hard and fast rule for, again, I've hit 50% on the opacity. There's not often a hard and fast rule for, what works or what doesn't, or right, how you kind of have to shade something, whether it has to be realistic. Can be totally okay to just kind of make stuff up, right? And again, once you're in line and color land, there's a lot of freedom. There's a lot of flexibility that comes from the ideas of line and color. So the lines are holding a lot of the illustrative sort of drawing, right? The structure is delineated by the lines. And what that means is it kind of frees us up a little bit to, play around with the color, especially if, again, I'm not stepping down in value heaps, that you're still going to sort of perceive the difference between, the skin and the other sort of colors here as, being primarily a sort of a color or a flat contrast, right? We're not going to really understand this via lighting, right? It's still going to be a shape-based illustration, if that makes sense. So again, this is where, style and many of those other ideas really sort of come from, right? It's all these kind of decisions that you make. So I'm using another technique that, I've used to varying degrees throughout the years, and that is I'm going to sort of block in a lot of the shadows with a hard brush, and then all I do is hit E for eraser and I kind of soften off the edge, and this gives me a good ability to get a cast shadow. Again, I haven't done anything on this channel about sort of rendering, but sort of a major sort of part of rendering, again, I'm just going to leave that sort of flat, is again understanding the difference between a cast and a form shadow. So a cast shadow is where the nose is casting a shadow down below it, and that is going to result in a hard edge. The form shadow is where, as the light sort of falls across the form of the nose, right, we sort of gradually, right, if we kind of, where's the face thing, right, so if you have like sort of a soft object, right, as the light kind of hits it and sort of falls off, right, it's going to get darker and darker and darker and darker, right? So that's like a form shadow. It's describing form going across. And so typically with those, you're going to get like a soft shadow, and then you sort of get a cast shadow where the object is sort of casting a much sort of harsher shadow. So again, just using that simple technique of blocking in with a nice sort of hard brush gives us these really kind of rough sort of shadows, but then if we just kind of soften them, it allows us to kind of do a bit of both. So anyway, I'm not necessarily sure how I kind of feel about this. Again, I'll do some color adjustment and other sort of adjustment as we go. None of this lighting is realistic. It's just kind of making stuff up. So again, I follow the same logic, except in this case, so I'm going to hide the line so I can just see that. I'm going to Control D for deselect. I'm going to hit W for wand. And in this case, what I'm thinking of grabbing is the hair and all that sort of blue stuff. Yeah, I do think I want that blue as well, right? So then we'll do that. I'm going to make a new layer. So we've got like a whole bunch of layers here, right? That are going to sort of describe, right, the general process. So here you can see Control H to hide that, right? That's sort of what we've done. Are we making it better? Who knows? So same thing, I'm going to select the blue, I'm going to make it darker, I'm going to make it a little bit less saturated. So what that is going to do is just kind of mean that the shadows are going to be a little bit cooler and darker. So we're going to put them a little bit more towards a gray. And this is where, again, you know, I feel like we can run into major trouble if we don't sort of watch out. So I've got to really sort of check the, again, a good thing I often recommend is to have a right, window arrange new window for this. And what we'll do is kind of pop this up on a second monitor, right? So I have a second monitor above this, and if I pop that up there, that allows me to kind of check some of those things. And by those things, I just mean the, you know, the way it sort of looks, right? So here, right, the question is like, how much shadow do I want to put? Let's try again, because I feel like that might be a bit too much. What I really want to do is just sort of darken things where I've sort of got slightly darker. Actually, what I'll do is yeah, so I've got one of these, let's go full screen, got one of these colors in foreground and the other in the background, and I'll just sort of alternate between them. But yeah, the main thing I'm sort of trying to do is just see if I can separate these out a little bit more. Now there is an extra sort of trick that I'm imagining I'm going to sort of add to this that might sort of help, where I'll probably put a bit of sort of large scale texture over the top of everything, and maybe sort of try and blur some of this down, right? Blur some of it away so that it's not quite so strong. But yeah, it's hard to say whether that is making it sort of better or worse, because again, it might be better to kind of have the, you know, like the overall feeling that the hair is sort of all one color. So again, what I might do is make a new layer. We'll get that brush. Let's make the brush, all right, a lot bigger, and we'll just kind of, all right, maybe sort of go over all of that. That might be a little bit much. Let's do it a little bit more selectively. So what I'm sort of doing here is just sort of thinking about, like, again, you know, what sort of contrast do I want? What sort of contrast do I want? Yeah, I feel like that sort of makes it feel more like sort of a giant sort of chunk of hair. Let's do same thing here. Make a new layer. I just make new layers because it's a little bit easier. Bit darker, bit less saturated, and we can sort of add a bit of tonality here. Oh, that's at 50%. Let's make that a little bit darker. So again, here as well, I might just sort of really focus on, again, putting a little bit of a shadow underneath that hair. So we've got that sort of contact point, which again just sort of pushes that sort of shadow of the hair forward a little bit. Here we go. Boom, boom, boom. And again, I think the goal here is just to make sure, again, we can do the same sort of trick there. Boom, boom. Yeah, so again, that might be a little bit much. We can sort of pull that down. Or again, I'll sort of do that and then sort of adjust, right? We'll sort of pull it back. Yeah, it can be hard to know how much, right? Is that making it better or worse? Because there is a flatness to this, which is kind of quite useful and interesting. So a lot of this stuff is about choice, right? It's not necessarily about like, oh, I'm rendering it and I'm going to have to render it properly, because I feel like I'm dealing much more with design than sort of realism, right? And again, here I think one of the things I'll probably end up doing is just kind of leave it as it is, and then we'll come back over the top. All right, but again, I feel like that is mostly it. I'm gonna sort of play around with blending, all right, some of this in, so it feels like it is sort of coming from her sort of skin, and I'll be able to use some selections in a little bit to sort of sort that out. And yeah, there's just a few little areas here where, as we sort of refine bits and pieces, then you kind of notice, boom, that, there's still a few little bits missing here and there. Clean that up. See how we go. You can see for some reason that has kind of gotten, right, a little bit lost. Yeah, so again, things that I would sort of do now is maybe add a little bit of texture, but before I do that, I'm just going to push these just see if I can sort of push some of this stuff back. Because I feel like that might be getting in the way a little bit. So again, these are sort of very small things. These are just, I'm not really sure this is going to make a difference, but yeah, just want to sort of be sure. All right, so now there's a few ways we could do this. We could sort of start doing this above the lines, which is probably a good idea. And what I'm going to do is select the sort of splatter texture, right, which is kind of this sort of chaos splatter texture. And I'm going to sort of use it everywhere, but again, we've got all these selections that we can use. I'm just going to set that to 20%, and what we're going to do, as I said, is kind of try and kind of blend some of these things together. So this is like a little bit like a wash or something. Now again, we're losing a lot of stuff, right? But as I said, that's fine, because we can always bring it back. But you sort of find, like, if we sort of go over everything, right, it'll give us some texture to begin with, right, which can be important. Again, we want focus on the face. That's the important bit. One of the real things that sort of has happened here is that, again, these sort of arms and things are actually, have quite a bit of vibrancy. So we actually might want to sort of tone that down. And again, using a complement will sort of help us do that. Other thing you can do is, again, I often do this with a new layer, is then select that sort of skin. And we'll do the same thing. Right, so and I have a whole video just on sort of adding texture. And again, I sort of talk about this idea. So we're sort of putting some of the background over the foreground, right, the focal area, and we're putting some of the focal area over the ground. And then if you sort of zoom in, right, you can see we've got a little bit of this kind of color interplay now, which again gives us just a little bit of sort of that visual interest. Now again, it's mostly a matter of sort of tweaking and adjusting where we do and don't want these bits and pieces. And the good thing about digital art is you can have multiple layers and kind of keep messing around with them, right? Keep playing with them. So one of the things I want to sort of think about is, again, let's take all that off and let's see if we can grab just this. Right, so I just want all of the magical stuff. Well, now let's make a new layer. And actually what I'm going to do is put a mask on that. Just that way I've always got those masked out. And what I'm going to try is just a gradient with kind of like, you know, like a reddy sort of orange. And what I'll do is set it to sort of hard light, but we'll see what sort of works, right? Ooh. So again, that's a bit much. Let's pull the opacity down. Try it. I don't know whether it working the other way be better. Let's make a new overlay. Again, I have new overlay set to its own action. All right. Again, I feel like that's probably more like what we need. And we're just going to pull the opacity of that down. Yeah. Again, just messing about. So again, I'm just trying to get some of that sort of gradient working. Another thing we can do here is, let's go neutral, selective color, and I'm just going to sort of punch. All right, really punch that sort of red up. And now we'll go select, color range. All right, and we'll probably need to. You can see we'd not. Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of cool as an idea. Yeah, we're sort of getting everything there. We probably don't need as much of the. All right, so I'm taking that selection, right, inverting it. There we go, that's what I was trying to do. There we go. Yeah, get that out. So again, just using, you know, color adjustment, messing around. Again, does this make it more interesting? Maybe, not really. So again, we could try. All right, like maybe it just needs to be like a more intense orange. I'm not sure. I feel like that might be, again, that might be cool. I still want to sort of focus on that sort of central area, right? But yeah. So we can also play around with, right, sort of some gradients. I often sort of talk about this as being, you know, one of those basic concepts that can often sort of really help make things interesting. Again, not sure whether that is making it more interesting or not, whether we can have sort of a blue. Yeah, I mean, I feel like something like that. Yeah, boom, but let's invert so we sort of get that happening. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's right. That's giving us that sort of alternate red-green. Now, again, like that's sort of interesting, right? It might be a little bit much. One of the things you sort of can do is just, we can take all this color adjustment, right? Turn it on, turn it off. Be like, does it make it better? Does it make it worse? And then we can just sort of reduce the, right? You're just sort of taking all of that stuff that we've done and pulling it all down, which I think can be super useful. So again, you know, other little sort of things that we could sort of play around with would be to, again, layer in some more of that sort of texture, which is sort of going to knock it all back a little bit, and then we could play with some levels, right? So again, get some so we're sort of knocking it back, and now I'm going to sort of bring it back up. And again, I often find it's a little bit easier to do these things with sort of separate color adjustments. Control I to invert, and I'm just going to bring that sort of brightness to the front there. And get an airbrush, make the airbrush bigger. Just try and sort of push in a little bit, right? So really are just sort of focusing there. New overlay, maybe we could try some kind of, right? If we sort of, right, just sort of push the contrast in the middle. Again, on some monitors, that's going to be sort of too much, right? On some, it's going to sort of work. What we can do is, again, take the saturation down, potentially. That might sort of solve some of those things, and then we could sort of color adjust it further. But yeah, I think. So again, here we've got a color adjustment. This can be also something you can play around with. Right, if we want to just sort of make sure that we pull back some of those areas, or we could sort of make it in. Right, this gives like a really weird sort of inverted look. That again can be sort of good, just to make it not feel so yellow. But yeah, anyway, you can play around with this for hours, which is sort of what I sort of often do. But again, part of what I'm doing before in those earlier steps is, again, trying to separate some of those colors out, add some extra color vibrancy, and probably what I do there again is just homogenize it a little bit, right? Bring it together. Do a few sort of, again, you know, the sort of typical tricks that I do to try and bring, right, some of this together. Again, just sort of spamming this everywhere, and then we'll sort of take it back where we want. Again, I'm not 100% sure that's sort of making any sort of major improvement anywhere. Yeah, probably could be better without most of that stuff. Why? Because again, there's already quite a bit of texture in the lines. Now, important to note that we can still adjust those lines quite a bit. Normally, I'll just make another levels layer there so we can play around with it separately. But yeah, if we do want to, right, sort of go through and push those lines, right, make them a little bit darker, we can. That might be something that kind of, you know, looks cool. Alright, so again, turn that on, turn that off. Yeah, I feel like a little bit more is kind of good, and we can also definitely, you know, just use that in particular areas. I feel like I kind of notice now that right, there's that bit there. Gotta get rid of that. But yeah, anyway, I think that's probably where I'll sort of leave it for now. Again, just sort of messing about, you know, having fun. You know, the last thing I do is probably, you know, play around with adding some noise or, you know, sort of other things that can be sort of useful from a textural sort of standpoint. So in that case, again, I'll make a new layer. We'll fill it with 50%. Boom. Gray. Filter. Noise. Add noise. Gaussian. There we go. Now we'll make it overlay. Right. And now I'm just going to zoom it up. The reason I do that is that again, this might be one of these old techniques that's a little bit outdated, but I find the noise is like a little bit small. So I kind of tend to play around with it a little bit. So yeah, so add some things like that to kind of just clear up the, yeah, just kind of like push it together a little bit more, add a little bit more sort of visual interest. Again, you know, I don't know how big this is. It's pretty sort of big. Again, 5,000 pixels high. So that might be the sort of thing that, again, you know, you notice if you sort of print it out large or if you sort of zoom in. But yeah, anyway, that's probably enough for this one. Good sort of little, you know, example of how I'd normally play around with this. Yeah, and again, you know, I probably wouldn't spend quite as much time as I have on it, you know, sort of today talking through it. This might normally be, again, sort of 20 to 30 minutes. Again, just color it, post it. Again, work on illustration skills, right? Work on some of those skills that, you know, are just really, really basic and will, you know, help to train us to create better illustrations. Here I've got one thing there, another one of these little things we kind of notice. I think it's just something there that could be deleted. Yeah, so we just notice these things as we go, keep fiddling with it. But yeah, you know, I would say, as I said in the video where I sort of made this image, I think that was posted this week, talking about, you know, planning even your simple drawings. If we plan this and just work on your illustration and start to think about how, again, we can add these elements, we can make them different colors, you know, we can think about how color might play into it, sort of movement, etc., etc. You start to build an idea so that, again, as you're drawing it, you can kind of imagine, oh yeah, if I kind of, you know, combine these shapes and these shapes, but then, you know, the skin kind of will sort of create this second shape on top of everything. You start to draw with that in mind, right? And again, it's the iteration that helps you do that. It's the repetition of, you know, sitting there thinking about composition as you're drawing a little thumbnail. But again, sort of then maybe imagining the color, right? Maybe imagining some of this other stuff that sort of goes onto it as you do that. There's no way to do that without mileage, right? Without just doing a lot of it. And as you can see, we could spend another 1 or 2 hours fiddling around with this, just from a line and color standpoint, right, making it cleaner. But again, it's that muscle you want to build of imagining how the color and the finish that you put on an image, and how all of those things work with your thumbnail, right? It's just iterating that concept will just naturally sort of make you understand how those things connect together. And then ultimately the idea is that as you work on your thumbnail, you can sort of start to imagine this, right? You can start to sort of imagine how it will all fit together. Anyway, that's all I've got for this one. We'll catch you around. Happy drawing.